Well, Dr. Lawrence, thank you for joining me here today. We're going to talk a little bit about those 8 days in March, the 9th through the 16th of March in 1968. But to put this in perspective, um, if it's okay with you, I'm gonna give a bit of a historical overview, and I know you'll correct me if I'm wrong or if I leave anything out. But most people don't realize that the US had advisors in Vietnam as early as 1950. Okay, they were first advising the French that were a colonial power there in Vietnam, and then when the French left, advising the South Vietnamese and the democratic government that was installed there. Um, Over time, the number of US advisors grew and the things they were asked to do became more and more diverse and more dangerous. And so there were more Americans who were killed. But then came the fall of 1964, when a US Navy ship was attacked off the coast of North Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin. And it was believed that the attack was sponsored by the communist government that was installed in North Vietnam. And I think we can all imagine that if a US ship was attacked today, the American public would expect and certainly be in support of some kind of response by the US government. And that's exactly what happened. In March 8th of 1965 was the landing of a Marine brigade, the first large-scale land unit in Vietnam. From that period, the troop levels increased quickly, and the kinds of missions we took on increased. The peacetime draft that had been in place since World War II was greatly expanded. The number of American deaths started increasing as well. And for the very first time, Americans were watching all of this happen in their own living rooms as television became prevalent throughout our country. And in spite of the military leaders, particularly General Westmoreland and President Johnson, assuring the American people that the war was all but won, the number of American deaths increased and public sentiment had started turning against the war effort. So during these 3 years, there was great turmoil back home as well, from politics to the civil rights movement to the counterculture and anti-war protests starting. And all of these things were leading up to 1968. So that seems to be a good place to start. Did I miss any of the highlights?
That's a pretty good capsule history. And Jim, let me say just quickly, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure, totally. Well, as we make our way to focus in on those 8 days in March, what was going on in Vietnam and back home as 1968 began?
Well, I think you're quite right in suggesting that to appreciate the importance of those 8 days, it's important to set that period within the larger frame. And of course, one could start the story almost anywhere in the history of American involvement in Vietnam, but you've given us a great capsule history of American involvement down to, let's say, 1967. So I would say one good place to pick up the story is in late 1967. By this point, the generalization I think that's safe to offer is that the war had become a very bloody, grueling stalemate on both sides. On the American side, Lyndon Johnson and his administration were increasingly frustrated that they were unable to make progress in the war, and they made a decision um, to stick with it nevertheless, despite the frustrations of that moment. They were aware of declining public support for the war, and this concerned them greatly. And at the end of 1967, in November in particular of that year, the Johnson administration decided that the key challenge to keeping the United States fighting and pursuing the victory that many Americans still believed was in reach at that point was basically to head off the growing public opinion problem that threatened to undermine the war effort. So Lyndon Johnson himself and other key administration officials, and most famously General William Westmoreland, the overall commander of US forces in Vietnam, deliver a series of speeches, make a series of statements that are designed to reassure the American public. LBJ, as I say, made statements himself. I think most famously, William Westmoreland said, not that the light is at the end of the tunnel. I think that is sometimes assumed as something that he said in this period. But he said that we were at a point where the end was starting to come into view. In other words, the United States had been making progress, and it was reasonable to think that before too long, he suggested perhaps another 2 years, the United States could withdraw its forces with some semblance of victory having been achieved. So the spin, in other words, was quite positive in late 1967.
So we go into 1968, and what happened in the spring, late winter, spring of 1968 in Vietnam?
So the big moment comes at the very end of January 30th, 1968, with the initiation by communist forces of the so-called Tet Offensive. This was a massive offensive, the likes of which had never been attempted by communist forces, that coincided with the Tet holiday, the Lunar New Year, essentially. And the goal of the Tet Offensive, which had been in the works in Hanoi among communist decision makers for many months by this point, was, in the best case, to inspire a popular uprising against the South Vietnamese government. Short of that, North Vietnamese leaders also hoped that they could, of course, inflict serious damage on ARVN, that is to say South Vietnamese forces and US forces, and also nudge the political debate within the United States in a direction that would increasingly make it difficult for the US administration to carry on the war. But the principal goal was what the North Vietnamese called the general uprising. They wanted, in other words, to inspire a popular rebellion against the South Vietnamese government that they believed would be, of course, the quickest, most efficient way to end the war before long on communist terms. And their principal method for trying to do that was to take the war into the cities. What really distinguished the Tet Offensive from other communist military operations up until that point was that it was really focused on the cities. That is to say, the bastion of strength, such as it was for the South Vietnamese government.
Well, the Tet Offensive was extensive. I mean, it was simultaneous, near simultaneous attacks in dozens of cities and other locations throughout South Vietnam. So obviously the northern forces, both the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong insurgents, had infiltrated all throughout the South, and they were coordinated enough to launch these simultaneous attacks, something that the American public had been led to believe was impossible given the state of the enemy, according to the president and to General Westmoreland.
Exactly. And Walter Cronkite famously said, "What the hell is going on here? I thought we were winning," right? What the communists turned out to be capable of was totally at odds, exactly as you've suggested, with what the president, General Westmoreland, and others had led the American public to believe was the actual state of the war. And you're quite right in suggesting that the Tet Offensive was something that affected virtually all of South Vietnam, and as I mentioned, was focused on the bastions of South Vietnamese strength, namely the cities. The attacks, by one count at least, occurred on 100 different towns and cities across South Vietnam on 36 of the 44 provincial capitals. So this was really very extensive military operation, the likes of which most Americans believed was not possible.
Well, and while most of it was against population centers, there was one notable military target that actually started a week or two before Tet, right? And that was at the Marine base at Khe Sanh.
Correct. In fact, the North Vietnamese, as part of their preparations for the Tet Offensive, had initiated pretty heavy fighting along the demilitarized zone, that is the northernmost parts of South Vietnam, from the fall of 1967. And we can now see that this was part of a deliberate strategy to draw American and ARVN strength out of the urban areas into remote parts of very northern South Vietnam,
Mhm.
and also along the border areas with Laos and Cambodia, as a way to weaken the defense of the cities, and also, of course, to create the illusion that those rural areas were, in fact, the target of communist military strategy. Now, American intelligence was aware that lots of equipment was flowing into the South. They were loosely aware that something big was afoot. But I think generally it's a safe generalization to say that American commanders took the bait and devoted enormous resources to the defense of a position, Khe Sanh, that turned out to be largely, from the communist point of view, a diversionary strategy.
So, how long did the Tet Offensive last?
Well, not very long, really, I think is the simplest way to answer that question. Um, in fact, American and ARVN forces responded very quickly and effectively, I think one must say, to the attacks on this enormous array of towns and cities. And communist forces, whether North Vietnamese troops or Viet Cong and NLF troops, were pushed out of virtually all of those urban areas very, very quickly, within a matter of hours or at the most days. There was one very significant exception, and that was the famous Battle of Hue City, very bloody affair in the old imperial capital of Vietnam. It took, in that case, until the 2nd of March for U.S. Marines and their ARVN allies to liberate the city. So that was one exception. But even there, it was just a bit more than a month before the communist gains achieved in the early parts of the offensive were reversed.
So, I've heard others say that the U.S. troops actually won every major engagement, and as you said, repelled or regained ground or pushed back the North Vietnamese attacks and their efforts. So militarily, it was a major U.S. victory. But I think it had the desired effect from the North's perspective. It had the desired effect back home in the States of degrading the trust of our political and military leaders of what was the state of the war in Vietnam. And that was that kind of couple of month period up until early March.
I think that's right. The real setback for the United States and for South Vietnam was in the political arena. And certainly the American home front is one of the places to look to see the very significant setbacks. I think it's also important to mention that the Tet Offensive and the counterattacks were enormously disruptive to pacification efforts in the countryside, and that this was another significant consequence. So while it is, I suppose, basically true that American and ARVN forces, won the battles of that counterattack. As always, it's important to remember that the Vietnam War was about a lot more than just who won on the battlefield. And in this very important respect, the Tet Offensive and the counterattack was very arguably a significant setback on the American ARVN side as well. But still, I would certainly agree with you that the biggest consequences of Tet come on the American home front, where lots of Americans start to draw the conclusion that the United States was bogged down in as Walter Cronkite famously put it at the end of February, in a hopeless stalemate, and really didn't have the keys to victory. And this changed the calculus for the Johnson administration very significantly.
Well, and all of that was very new as we start going into March of 1968. And now we can focus on those 8 days. The names of over 300 Americans that were killed during this 8-day period span from the bottom of panel 43 East, cover all of panel 44 East, and then go over to the top of panel 45 East on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. So that panel 44 really does encapsulate those 8 days. Um, can you give us a sense of what was happening during this 8-day period that resulted in the loss of those American lives?
Well, on the battlefield, there's absolutely no question that the fighting continued in a very intensive way across the month of March and across the remainder of 1968. 1968 was the bloodiest year of the Vietnam War. So one can say that the Tet Offensive was really over. The Tet Offensive and the counterattack were really over by the first days of March. But of course, this only means that the war resumed its very bloody, constant toll of battle and bloodshed that, of course, had been the norm across 1966 and 1967. So, long story short, the 8 days that we're talking about in March remained a period of very bloody losses for all sides in Vietnam, as American and ARVN forces continued to push communist forces back from the areas that had been taken as a consequence of the offensive, and tried to capitalize, as General Westmoreland would have seen it, on the significant gains that had been made in the course of recapturing those urban areas. But most of the action, I suppose, that makes this particular 8-day period so fascinating occur in the political and policy-making realm back in the United States.
So, what were some of the specific things that happened during that 8-day period?
Well, right at the beginning of that 8-day period, um, the New York Times carries a bombshell right on March 9th of 1968. A few days or a couple of weeks before, the Joint Chiefs of Staff and General Westmoreland had made clear that they would request an additional infusion of American manpower into South Vietnam to try to capitalize on the military gains that had been made as a consequence of the Tet counterattacks. On March 9th, the New York Times published news for the first time that a request had been made for 206,000 more soldiers. And remember, this is at a time when there were already more than 500,000 Americans fighting in Vietnam. This news report was a bombshell that stirred outrage among both hawks and doves. A lot of questions about what was going on. Did the administration have a reasonable strategy? What was the limit on how far the United States would go? Was it reasonable to think that the United States could actually achieve something positive, no matter what level of manpower was committed to Vietnam? And that was only the first day of this 8-day span of time. This was also an important period in the run-up to the 1968 presidential election. Of course, in November, this was the period of the primaries, and the Democratic primaries, particularly the New Hampshire primary that occurred in this 8-day span, became a kind of referendum on Lyndon Johnson's conduct of the war. Famously, Eugene McCarthy, this relatively dovish senator from Minnesota, ran against LBJ and captured a good proportion of the vote in New Hampshire, and this was widely viewed as a sign of growing dissatisfaction with LBJ's leadership and the growing popularity of an anti-war position within the Democratic Party. And of course, this is an important moment in what many historians have seen as the kind of fracture of the Democratic Party that played out across 1968.
And what else was happening during this period?
Well, imagine how disappointed and bitter Lyndon Johnson was becoming as he was increasingly under attack from political rivals. And at the same moment, he confronted an economic crisis. He became increasingly aware in this period, not to say for the first time, but intensely aware in this period of a number of economic problems that were attributable, at least in part, to the war. Inflation, Growing budget deficits were a growing problem. In this period, his Treasury Secretary Fowler basically told LBJ in no uncertain terms that he was going to have to slash his budget requests and or raise taxes before very long if he wanted to head off economic disaster. At the same time, on the economic stage, the gold crisis um, really intensified in this period, such that on March 14th, the gold market in London was shut down by the British government, an almost unimaginable response by international financiers to what was understood as a major cataclysm. And this was, of course, attributable to a number of factors, but certainly the enormous expenses of the war in Vietnam was one of the factors that was undermining confidence in the US dollar and leading foreigners to cash in their dollar reserves for gold, such that the promise that dollars could be converted into gold could no longer really be upheld in the international market. So here was another major crisis. On top of the political problems besetting LBJ came an economic crisis as well.
So he was under attack on the battlefield in the aftermath of the Tet Offensive. Wanted to fill the request for another 200,000 troops, which in itself would be very costly. He's seeing huge deficits already from the war effort. He needs money. Being told he has to raise taxes, but he can't even secure those dollars with gold from the Federal Reserve because of the issues in the gold market, all based on uncertainty over what would be the future of the war.
Exactly. I think that there are a number of factors in play. The American economy was weakening, one might say, across the later 1960s for a variety of reasons, but certainly the war was a big part of that. And coming at this moment of maximum controversy surrounding the war, it's no surprise that the war was seen as a major cause of this problem.
Well, and one of the things happening back on the battlefield was some other intense fighting, as you've said. Can you talk a little bit about Lima Site 85?
Sure, it's a fascinating moment in the history of the war. So Lima Site 85 was a radar installation that had been constructed by the US Air Force on Laotian territory just across the border from Vietnam, and it was a site that was very important to conducting the bombing raids against North Vietnam that had been going on since 1965. The communist forces were certainly increasingly aware of the importance of this installation, and in the period that we're talking about, I believe it was March 10th and 11th, the North Vietnamese forces, in collaboration with their Laotian counterparts, the Pathet Lao, launched an attack against this radar site, and of course this led to very bitter fighting in this mountaintop location, and ultimately to the capture of this installation. I believe I'm right saying this was the biggest loss of life, the most intense fighting perhaps, and certainly the biggest loss of life for Air Force personnel in the entire Vietnam War.
Well, and it was actually a site run by the CIA, right? So it was a listening post, a radar post, and then had some American military there. But the American military wasn't supposed to be there. So all of that was still classified at the time. And my understanding is the site itself, the mountaintop description was very apt. I mean, it was literally the top of a mountain with a sheer cliff down one side, and it was considered impenetrable. And there was acceptance that if the site were ever overrun in any way, that there would be no way to defend it.
Yeah, the pictures of the mountain are remarkable. I recommend that anyone interested in this fascinating episode take a look online, and you can see exactly what you're talking about, those sheer cliffs which I imagine made some folks confident that it could, of course, be defended, but also created the problem that if a serious attack were launched, it would also perhaps be indefensible.
Well, and then the impossible happened. The enemy forces actually scaled that cliff and attacked Lima Site 85. And there was no way to defend it. The decision was ultimately made to bomb the site, to wipe it off the map, to prevent the enemy from being able to capture and or use that site or gain intelligence that would be important to their war efforts. So during that period, there were a number of losses. 12 Americans were killed, 4 others were rescued, and there were a number of CIA personnel who were unaccounted for until some period after 1998, when a translated description of the whole incident finally surfaced, and then eventually it was declassified. And so it's an interesting story. One of the notable people listed on panel 44 was one of those 12 that lost their life, and that's Air Force Chief Master Sergeant Richard Edgeberger, who eventually received the Congressional Medal of Honor.
A fascinating story, and of course, just one of the fascinating stories represented on that panel. But the story of the Lima site is unquestionably, exactly as you say, one of those really remarkable moments that has come to light. I guess it's not exactly new anymore, but it's been out there for 20 years. But it's taken a long time, I think, for the full history of the Vietnam War to become known because of the sensitivity and secrecy around certain dimensions of it. It's a good example of why it's important for historians to keep chipping away at the history of the war. New things are out there for us to discover.
All right. There was another significant occurrence during this 8 days in March, on March 16th. Can you tell me about that?
Sure. I think you're talking about the My Lai massacre, which occurred exactly as you say on the final day of the period in question on March 16th. The My Lai massacre was carried out by the so-called Charlie Company of the AmeriCal Division. This unit had been operating for a good chunk of time under very stressful circumstances in the central coastal region of South Vietnam. And very long story short, on that morning of March 16th, were operating in an area where there had been a lot of communist activity. The unit was under the impression that the village of My Lai, like other neighboring villages, had been a major focus of communist strength in the area. When American forces got to My Lai, however, they discovered old men, women, children, in other words, no sign of military forces whatsoever. But orders were given to fire on the old men, women, children who were gathered together by American forces as they searched through the huts for evidence of communist military activity. And ultimately, I believe the best number available to us right now is 504 South Vietnamese civilians were killed over the span of about 4 hours. So clearly this was the worst atrocity carried out by American forces in Vietnam, something that was covered up for a period of time, but gradually became known, and I think it's fair to say it has become synonymous with war crimes in American military history ever since, and certainly gave the war a very yet another black eye on top of all the other black eyes the war had already suffered as that news came out in 1969 and 1970, thanks to the important, hardworking, investigative work that was done both within the military and also by journalists who ultimately uncovered the whole story.
Yeah, a really dark day in American military history for sure. So it was an interesting year, 1968, certainly in the early part with the Tet Offensive. A lot of things happening back home. During this 8-day period, March 9th through 16th of 1968, 398 Americans lost their lives. 377 of them are represented on panel 44 East. During just that 8-day period, there were 16 Marines killed at Khe Sanh. Over the entire length of the war, over 350 lost their lives just at Khe Sanh. And then just one other incident, Lena Site 85, 12 Americans lost their lives. So there was fighting in areas across the entire country, and very eventful for those 398 families, who lost their loved ones, represented on panel 44. As we leave those 8 days in March, can you give us an overview of what happened in the rest of 1968, of why this period was so impactful?
Absolutely. So in this 8-day period, as I've suggested, President Johnson came under enormous stress politically, economically, and perhaps in other ways as well. And we now can see, with the benefit of hindsight, where all this was leading. At the very end of March, on March 31st, LBJ went before a nationwide audience and made two announcements. First of all, he announced that the United States would significantly cut back on its bombing of North Vietnam and would seek peace negotiations with the North Vietnamese. So very significant change in the conduct of the war. And then, of course, more famously, LBJ also announced that he would not seek the Democratic nomination for president. So this was a major watershed moment, to put it mildly, in the history of the war. Nevertheless, the fighting continued, as we've mentioned, at a very high level across the remainder of 1968. There were certainly some members of the Johnson administration that urged, in no uncertain terms, that LBJ should really get serious about seeking a negotiated settlement, even if that would entail significant concessions. There were others within his administration who felt as though the battlefield situation had improved so much as a consequence of the Tet counterattacks that the United States could take its time at the negotiating table and ultimately push the communists into concessions that would result in a peace that was a little bit easier for the United States to take. I think on balance, LBJ chose the latter course. He continued to pursue the war at a very high level. I think although negotiations opened on March 13th, famously those negotiations really got nowhere for many, many weeks, and arguably for months and even years after they first opened. So the battle continues, the fighting continued at a very high level. I'd say LBJ's political problems, of course, were resolved to some extent by his announcement that he would no longer be in the bullseye for the Democratic Party. But political turmoil, of course, continued to unfold across the remainder of 1968. The Democratic Party increasingly fractured, I think is often the word that gets used, between those elements that became synonymous with Hubert Humphrey, LBJ's vice president, that continued to pursue much the same Vietnam policy that had animated the Democratic Party up until that point, whereas Eugene McCarthy and ultimately Robert Kennedy came to the fore as the embodiments of a new anti-war approach that appealed to many within the Democratic Party. So you see these two factions fighting it out increasingly across 1968, and that tension really culminated at the Democratic National Convention at the end of August, which gives rise to street fighting, brutality, really ugly scenes in the streets of Chicago that I think give us some of the most famous images of that very controversy-filled year of 1968. So the Tet Offensive was um, just the beginning of the turmoil and controversy that would continue to unfold in the United States across the remainder of that year.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your perspective and helping us understand the Vietnam War writ large to a greater degree, and certainly focusing on those 8 days in March, March 9th to 16th, 1968. Thank you, Dr. Lawrence.
Thanks so much, Jim. Thanks for having me.